Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in.
Okay, happy Wednesday, everybody. First up, sadly, large parts of Beijing and the surrounding areas of northern China have been devastated by a massive amount of rain over the last few days, already resulting in at least 20 dead and many more missing. The rainfall has broken all sorts of records. Over a 72-hour period, 1,657 stations in Hebei, the northern province which hugs the capital, exceeded 250 millimeters. 173 stations exceeded 500 millimeters, and one city saw over 1,000 millimeters of rain. This is the largest rainfall in the province since 1963, and in the capital, Beijing, it's the largest ever recorded. The extreme rainfall was in part caused by Typhoon Doksuri, with floods especially triggered along the Yellow and Huaihe rivers. The Ministry of Water Resources said that 13 rivers exceeded warning levels in the Huaihe Basin, which includes Beijing, Tianjin, and northern Hebei. State-run Global Times wrote yesterday, quote, "In many parts of Hebei, the disaster was extremely serious, among which the flow of many rivers in Zhuozhou increased significantly, with newly added floodwaters covering an area of about 20 square kilometers." End quote. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai writes the same day that in that city, Zhuozhou, the depth of the floodwaters exceeded 3 meters, 10 feet, in some parts of the city. Adding, quote, "The city is divided in half by the water, and many areas have become isolated islands. The People's Hospital has also lost power, increasing the difficulty of rescue efforts. Regular fast rescue boats cannot enter. Only very small boats can get in." End quote. Beijing censors have had to move quickly to quell unsubstantiated rumors online that Zhuozhou was flooded because the government was diverting floods to protect Beijing. Some high-profile state media writers have already published articles to refute the rumor. Yesterday, Tuesday, General Secretary Xi Jinping, quote, "demanded all-out search and rescue efforts to find people missing or trapped in the floods," end quote, in the words of state-run Xinhua. Next up, let's talk semiconductors. Washington's 9-month-old policy of denying Beijing access to the most advanced semiconductors and the tools to make them is starting to bite. At least that is what is indicated in the most recent reports on the subject. U.S. financial media outlet The Wall Street Journal reports this week that semiconductor imports to China are falling, with Chinese companies saying that they are struggling to get components and machinery. As we have seen in previous videos, chipsets that have been remodeled to make them less powerful so that they fall within the U.S. rules are now threatened by the possibility of additional restrictions. China's response to this has primarily been twofold. One, pour as much into R&D, and some commentators have also accused Beijing of increasing intellectual property theft efforts in order to catch up, and two, investing in new factories with less advanced machines or legacy technology to chase that part of the market not affected by the sanctions. Indeed, in an article this week called "US-Europe are growing alarmed by China's rush into legacy chips," US financial media outlet Bloomberg writes that senior EU and US officials are concerned about Beijing's drive to dominate the market for legacy chips for both economic and security reasons. Quote, "They worry Chinese companies could dump their legacy chips on global markets in the future, driving foreign rivals out of business, like in the solar industry." End quote. The outlet explains that the most advanced semiconductors are those produced using the thinnest etching technology, with 3 nanometers state-of-the-art today. Legacy chips, however, are typically considered those made with 28 nanometer equipment or above. Quote, "technology introduced more than a decade ago." End quote. Some commentators in China have argued that the US restrictions on China may end up being a blessing in disguise. For example, in a recent article, prominent technology influencer Dai Laoban told his audience, quote, "Before the chip war, China had many struggling equipment, material and small chip companies that were difficult to compete with foreign counterparts. Our companies did not pay much attention to them because they could buy more mature and cost-effective foreign products. However, the US blockade of the Chinese chip industry has brought a rare opportunity for these companies. Under the blockade, domestic companies that were previously ignored by wafer fabs or test and packaging factories were pushed to the forefront. A large number of equipment and materials were sent to production lines for validation. End quote. Whether the author's optimism ends up being well placed or not, we will need to see. Meanwhile, while we're still on the topic of semiconductors, and as it relates to trade, economics, and national security, in an article this week, Greg Allen, the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies at the U.S. think tank Center for Strategic and International Studies, writes that blocking China's access to AI chips matters to U.S. national security. Allen argues that, quote, China's explicit policy goal, the one underlying its 2014 announcement of more than $100 billion in semiconductor industry subsidies, was to replace US and allied chips and chip-making technologies with Chinese alternatives. This was China's plan not only before President Biden took office, but 2 years before former President Donald Trump. Some critics who are not familiar with the particulars argue that the Biden administration's policy is one of decoupling. This is simply wrong. The policy targets advanced versions of niche products within the semiconductor industry. In reality, China's policy, the one that it has been spending hundreds of billions of dollars on since 2015, is much closer to a decoupling strategy than the Biden administration's policy. End quote. Next up, and finally for today's episode, we move to the economy and China's shrinking manufacturing activity. Hey everyone, if you enjoyed today's episode of China Update, don't forget to hit that like button. Liking, sharing, subscribing. 50% of viewers are not subscribed yet. These things are all huge helps for the channel, and for anyone who can go the extra mile and help keep the channel financially sustainable, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. As always, thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, and finally for today's episode, according to the latest official data published by the National Bureau of Statistics this week, the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index was 49.3 in July, a gain of 0.3 points versus June, but still below the benchmark of 50, indicating contraction. The non-manufacturing PMI, which includes sectors such as construction and agriculture, fell to 51.5 from 53.2 the previous month, far short of the 53 forecast by Goldman Sachs. It was a similar story with the release of the Caixin China General Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, a Caixin-sponsored survey which seeks to give a more independent snapshot of the country's manufacturing situation, which was published the next day on Tuesday, yesterday. The Caixin PMI dropped to 49.2 from 50.5 in June, the second consecutive monthly decline and the first contraction in 3 months. In a report accompanying the survey results, Chinese financial media outlet Caixin observed that the decline in the PMI in July suggests, quote, China's economic recovery has continued to lose steam. GDP growth had already come in lower than market expectations in the second quarter, following a promising increase in the first quarter. End quote. Regular viewers of China Update, of course, will not be surprised by any of this. Despite the deteriorating market conditions, Caixin observes, manufacturers remained somewhat optimistic about the outlook for the next 12 months, however, with the gauge for future output expectations at its highest level in 3 months, although it still fell short of its historical average. Wang Zhe, the senior economist at Caixin Inside Group, which puts the survey results together, expressed, quote, China's economy is facing new difficulties and challenges, mainly insufficient domestic demand, difficulties in the operations of some enterprises, risks and hidden dangers in key areas, and a complex and severe external environment. End quote. Adding that the survey, quote, indicates that overall manufacturing conditions worsened, with supply, demand, exports, and employment all deteriorating. The market has been lukewarm, with sluggish demand, and supply has shrunk in tandem, end quote. In the first half of this year, manufacturing accounted for 28% of China's GDP. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. Have a great Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.